Oregon's hot on the recruiting trail. Where do they turn next in 2025? I think it needs to be defensive line.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why if you have not already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to or watch this show. Pushing towards 6,000 on YouTube. I believe that we can get there. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. My guy Max Torres, Ducks Dish Podcast, over at Scoop Duck, joining me today to talk about this 2025 class, which as of today, Max, even after the string of commitments over the weekend, is now all the way down to 7th nationally in 24/7 Sports. It turns out Oregon's not the only school in the country getting commits. They did miss on Justin Hill. He chose Alabama, 4-star defensive lineman. And I think even with the Josiah Sharma addition, that's the position group where I feel like Oregon is going to go heaviest. I think linebacker could come into the fold here as well. But, offensively, they feel pretty darn set. Like maybe, if they get Michael Terry, maybe he ends up being a tight end and such. But to me, I look at this class compared to the last two for Oregon, both of which were in the top 10 and last year in the top 5. I think defensive line is where you're going to see the Ducks really start to make some pushes.
There's definitely some guys that they're recruiting at defensive line, Spencer, but I think I'd probably maybe go with the secondary as a little bit more of a spot to keep an eye on, especially with a couple of decisions coming in the next week or so. So I think that the names you're going to want to watch there are San Francisco, California, Archbishop Reardon athlete Chris Lawson, who primarily I thought when he landed on Oregon's radar was a receiver, but then there were like more and more legitimate conversations about him being a defensive back. And now we have Oregon with two corners in the fold. And then the other one that I think is probably a little bit more important to watch is Amarion Robinson out of Little Rock, Arkansas, Parkview High School. He took 2 recent official visits to Oregon and Oklahoma. I think that based on the recent conversations, it kind of seems a little bit more likely that Oregon may be passing on Lawson, but I think that they're still battling for Amarion Robinson, with it being a Ducks versus Sooners battle right now. Both of those guys, I think, are set to announce on or before July 7th. So definitely have some big-time talents that they're still in the mix for at D-line, but I'm personally not expecting a whole lot at that position in the near future.
I'll play devil's advocate to my own point here for just a moment and point out that Oregon in the 2023 and 24 recruiting classes, as Brian Smith has regularly said here on the show, recruited the defensive line as well as anybody in the country. And aside from Johnny Bowens, they haven't had anyone of those recruits transfer out. They've kept them at Oregon so far. Maybe they feel like their depth is so solid, they'll just add a couple of portal pieces next year. The edge guys who are going to be true sophomores this year, they'll all be back in 2025. Do you think maybe it's possible that you're right, that there are other positions that'll be of a higher priority because of how they've recruited that position in the last 2 cycles?
I think that's definitely a part of it, Spencer. And I know we talked about this before we went on air, but apologies if my audio is a little echoey. Literally almost an entirely empty room aside from my desk here.
You got to fill it out. Got to fill it out, man.
I know. I'm hoping to put up my my framed picture of Autzen that my girlfriend got me for Christmas. That would be a cool little background decoration.
Massive W.
But as it pertains to the question, I think the clip at which Oregon has recruited defensive line in the past couple of cycles certainly plays into it. I think that's probably why we're going to see a smaller crop of defensive linemen signed for the Ducks this year. But I think the secondary is obviously a big need right now for Oregon in the 2025 class, even with the additions of Dorian Bruin, Brandon Finney in the past week or so. And then I think that you also have to look at linebacker because the Ducks still don't have their first linebacker in the fold. I guess you can count Nasir Wyatt if you want. He's a linebacker.
I do not. I think Nasir Wyatt is playing edge all the way, and he's not playing. When I think linebacker, I think of what Jeffrey Bossa and Justin Jacobs are playing this season, not like you can get into technicalities and whatnot, but second level player is what I think of when I say Oregon is going to recruit, a linebacker or two this cycle.
Yeah, and I think it's just maybe worth noting, Spencer, even though he does play a lot of edge at the high school level at Mater Dei, I think he is kind of able to out athlete or out twitch a lot of the guys that he's going against, and he is pretty small for an edge. So, I mean, the people that I've talked to at Oregon about him, they're telling me edge, but that they're going to use him kind of all over the place. And I think that he really does kind of fit that tweener type of mold. And I think he might just end up being too big of an athlete to limit him to just putting his hand in the dirt or coming off the edge. So I think, especially with some of the recent announcements that we've seen, Noah McHale announcing for Texas A&M over Oregon, and Gavin Nix announcing for Miami over Oregon and Florida State, I think you're going to see Oregon kind of try to narrow their focus at linebacker. Which I think admittedly already had a pretty clear focus for which guys they were going after. McHale, Nix, Hill, even though he's edge linebacker. And then Keelan Moses, the LSU commit, that I think that they probably lead for right now. But that's going to be a really long play and a tough pull because he's from Baton Rouge and goes to school literally on LSU's campus. So that's going to be a tough one. So I think that there's definitely some defensive linemen in the fold there. I think if anything, you might want to keep an eye out, or if something were to happen, I should say, maybe you see a big time flip down the road, but I don't think anything in the immediate future as for right now. But we'll have to keep an eye on the Saturday Night Live visitors that come out to Eugene later this month when the dead period ends.
I think for Oregon in the secondary, DJ Pickett, definitely a name to watch for, 5-star defensive back out of the state of Florida. Jonah Williams as well, kind of a safety linebacker hybrid player of sorts. Oregon's been tied to them. Do you think those are kind of the highlight players to focus on for 2025?
They're certainly
in the secondary, I mean.
Sure. Yeah, I think those are some of the biggest ones. Trey McNutt is definitely another one that I think is worthy of being in that conversation. I have my pick in for Oregon there for the 5-star DB out of Cleveland. But Jonah Williams is definitely one that Oregon has made up some significant ground with in the last month or so. They brought him out for an official visit. And it seems like Oklahoma, a school that was really kind of tabbed as one of his early leaders, has kind of faded. But you still have Oregon surging there, and they're going to be battling the likes of Texas A&M in that recruitment. And that's going to be an interesting one to watch, Spencer, because I'll say it right now, in July, even if this guy ends up committing to Oregon, we don't even know if he's actually going to end up there because he's a legitimate MLB draft prospect. So I think it looks like kind of the conversation has been if he gets selected in the first 3 rounds, then that's probably going to be where he goes rather than play college football. But Jonah Williams is a special kind of player. You continue to recruit him. You continue to give him your best shot all the way until the very end.
I'm just going to put this out there. Mark Wazakowski's been to 2 consecutive super regionals. College baseball is an elite sport, and Bryce Betcher has proved you can, in fact, play both. I'm just saying, this thought crossed my mind a little bit. Another one that came across, got a couple questions about this and seen some content out there. Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart. How similar are their career trajectories right now? We'll talk about that coming up next. First, this episode is brought to you by Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. They make getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. You can save up to 60% with their last-minute deals for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account or redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So Max, Dan Lanning learned under Kirby Smart how to be a coordinator, saw, in the most upfront and personal way possible what it means to be a head coach. And There's been some national commentary about this. Josh Pate has talked about Dan Lanning recently and kind of his head coaching prospects. Do you see a lot of similarities between these two guys? They went from defensive coordinator to being the head coach of a premier program, and they have, really elevated that program to a place it hasn't been before. Now, for Lanning, that is so far only true on the recruiting trail, because Oregon has never pulled in back-to-back top 10 classes, and they have going into this year when they should be able to do so again. For Kirby Smart, it took quite a while for him to win his first national championship, but I don't know. What do you make of that kind of natural comparison of Dan Lanning, Kirby Smart, and how their careers have gone and will continue to go?
I think it's only natural, especially when you look at Dan Lanning rather, coming from Georgia, where he learned under Kirby Smart, and they also have the commonality or the common thread that they're both members of the Saban tree to some degree. Obviously, Smart was a coordinator, and I think Lanning was a GA, whatever it was. It wasn't as high of a position. But I think that you can see a lot of the similarities, the emphasis on recruiting. I think that you look at I think you see some similar personalities. I don't think maybe, I guess I'd say that Kirby and Dan are both pretty energetic guys, intense guys. But admittedly, I don't have my eye on Kirby quite as much maybe as I do Lanning, because I cover the Ducks. But I think that you see how they're building their programs, constructing their programs, and you see a lot of similarities. I think that right now it looks like Dan Lanning has the Ducks on that similar trajectory to make some noise and really kind of reach that Georgia level. I mean, that's certainly the standard that I think he is chasing and trying to live up to, not because he coached there and felt the need to, but he saw it work there. So why would you not go for what you saw work? And all the signs are certainly pointing to Oregon potentially being able to reach that, or at the very least, doing all the right things to make that play out before the season begins.
Yeah, I had Brian Smith on yesterday, and he said, Lanning is building Georgia West. That's what he's seeking to do, and I think that the similarities are there. They're both former defensive coordinators. Neither one calls defensive plays. When Lanning first got hired, I thought that's something he was going to do, but he does not. Obviously, he has a hand in what takes place defensively, but he doesn't actually call the plays defensively. They're both kind of that CEO head coach, that is really overseeing a program that places a heavy emphasis on recruiting. And, Kirby Smart, in the years leading up to their national championship seasons, he has averaged top 3 classes. I don't think any of the classes, including the year of that they won the national championship, they had a recruiting class lower than 3. Now, can Oregon ever get to that level one day? I mean, if you'd said Oregon pulled top 10 classes 15 years ago, that would have been a pretty crazy notion, because Chip Kelly was kind of just getting things rolling. And you look at those recruiting rankings, and they were good. There was, I think, a top 10 class in there, but they were mostly in like the 12 to 18 sort of range. So he's definitely elevated that particular standard. But as a recruiter, you cover this stuff even closer than I do. Where do you think Lanning can get to with Oregon recruiting?
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversation, Spencer, I know we were talking after the signing day for the 2024 class, and you were saying, hey, Oregon top 10 on a regular basis. And I'm saying, Spencer, I think it's even higher than that. I think top 5 on a regular basis is looking like more of a reality. And you see Oregon go on these crazy runs like they did in the last week, adding 5 new commitments, which brought them up to the number 5 spot, at least in the On3 rankings. I know different sites have different criteria and whatnot, but all the pieces are there. You have the past recruiting classes, you have the staff, you have Lanning, Lapoy, Will Stein, Marshall Malco helping run the show as well. I mean, they're a well-oiled machine by all definitions. And if you couple what they've been able to do this offseason, haven't played a game since New Year's Day, I think it was. If they have another special season, then you're just going to continue to see that arrow point way, way up. I think they're in another great spot to send a lot of guys to the NFL, which is a big part of the appeal with a lot of these recruits. So I think top 5 is definitely a realistic expectation in the 2025 cycle. And then just to sprinkle in a little bit of what our Steve Wiltfong wrote the other day, he was saying that Oregon's in contention for even the number 1 class in the country. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with what Justin Hopkins and I have talked about. We've never seen Oregon going after this many 5 stars, or maybe we've seen them going after as far as offers, but visits, real chances, or being in the mix until, kind of the very end. I don't think we've seen it to this level before. So I think that the way that I really look at Oregon recruiting in the big picture is that they're kind of, this is the new level, and they're about to kind of break through to a new level of the stratosphere, if you will. I'm not sure if that was the right term, but it's looking good.
They're trying to break through the stratosphere. I guess that would be. I don't know.
They're going to space, Spencer. They're sending the man to the moon again.
To the moon, indeed. I mean, the possibility. I haven't even talked about that on the show before. The idea of having the number 1 class in the country. God, I just.
Which Oregon has done before. They did have the number 1 class at one point under Willie Taggart.
Yep, that's true.
Class, and I think that was on Rivals. So just some background there. I remember seeing that.
I'm just thinking about what that would entail, because it feels like right now that's just gotta be Georgia every year. Like beating Georgia look at what Georgia just did on the recruiting trail. We're talking about Dan Lanning, against Kirby Smart. USC had a pair of 5-star defensive line commits, and they were from the state of Georgia. And at the time, it was a really, really impressive feat by USC to go into Kirby's backyard and pull those guys out. Yeah, that didn't last. Kirby went in and got both and flipped him. And it feels like until Georgia starts to take a step back, like maybe Oregon just has to match Georgia's level on the field. Maybe they have to go out and win a couple playoff games. Like if Oregon makes a splash in the Big Ten, if they win the Big Ten this year and they win, 1 or 2 playoff games and they're in the national semifinals, maybe then they could get there. I just have a hard time seeing, and maybe I'm just stuck in my ways mentally or something. I don't even know. I think in 2025, it's tough. But if Oregon has a great season, then I could see him catapulting on that. But Georgia just feels so tough to beat on the trail right now.
Georgia's hot for sure. I mean, just to go back to your first part of the point there, I never thought Isaiah Gibson or Justice Terry was going to stick with USC. Not only do you have the location, the distance factor, and all that, whatever, USC hasn't done it on the field. Like, I'm not just saying that because I cover Oregon.
When they went 11-1 a couple of years ago, they weren't bad. Last year they were not great.
Let me rephrase. Defensively, they haven't done it on the field. I don't think there's anything to inspire confidence right now in the defensive lineman going to USC, aside from the addition of Coach Henney, who has been one of the best coaches of defensive linemen. Obviously worked with Aaron Donald and all that. The USC has Leonard Williams in the NFL and all that. Who's honestly probably one of my favorite Trojans in the NFL. I wish the Niners could have gotten him.
My brother and I have always looked at that guy and said,
Seahawks now, right?
He is on the Seahawks, and let me tell you, I love having him there because he, I'm pretty sure they re-signed him this offseason. But my brother and I both refer to all the time the play where Mariota ran outside the pocket under pressure against USC, and Leonard Williams tracked him down and tackled him, and that was the craziest. I mean, it is the craziest thing to say that a defensive lineman could track down the fastest quarterback in Oregon history.
Yeah, that's pretty nuts for sure. But I went on a little tangent there with USC. I mean, yeah, it's tough to see Oregon beating out the likes of Georgia and Ohio State. I think that Ohio State's another really, really big heavyweight on the recruiting trail. We had the commitment of Justin Hill just earlier today between Oregon, Ohio State, and Bama. He ended up choosing Bama. And all 3 of those schools have been doing really well this summer, but the loss of an in-state player for the Buckeyes has not become a regular occurrence, so that can't be sitting well with them. But yeah, I think to your point, if Oregon puts together a special season, I think that a number 1 class looks a lot more realistic. But I'll put it to you this way, and I'm sure this is how Steve was looking at it. I think they're in on enough of those top tier guys for that to even be a conversation. And maybe that's something that we need to acknowledge as well. But I don't know, Spencer. I think when you see Oregon go on these recruiting runs and you see Oregon's success rate as far as maintaining commitments, I just don't understand these people that are on Facebook saying, oh man, call me in December. Like, who cares? A verbal commitment means nothing.
Oh, yeah.
I just don't get it. I don't get it.
Like
I mean,
verbal commits in June and July probably remain committed to that school, 85+% of the time, at least
yeah.
85%.
And I can understand that, there's a lot of changing elements with NIL and just other stuff going on. But as it pertains to Oregon, they do a really good job of having their commits stick in the fold.
They didn't have a single flip last year in the 2024 class. Everyone that verbally committed to Oregon or was going into National Signing Day, none of them flipped. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that
Trying to check on
being the case. I don't think they had anyone flip. They had decommits before National Signing Day during the summer, but everyone that was verbally committed on that December signing day stayed committed to the Ducks. And I think that's really, really impressive.
Yeah, it's special. It's special for sure. So I think that they're going to be able to continue pushing the envelope and that there's no reason to think that they won't be able to continue to raise the ceiling on what they're doing as a recruiting program right now.
We're going to flip around a little bit and talk some schedule, because this year's schedule has got plenty of tough games and it's got a trap game or two. But overall, it is incredibly favorable. Is Oregon locked into a 10-plus win season? We'll talk about that next. I like Oregon's schedule a lot, Max. I think having Ohio State at home and Michigan on the road is the easier split. I think if those were flipped, Oregon's win total on FanDuel would be 9.5 instead of 10.5. But you get those games like that. Washington is at home. You're going to be a big favorite in every non-conference game. I mean, last year they blasted Oregon State 31-7. And yeah, it's on the road this year. Oregon actually hasn't won since 2018, but that Oregon State team is not going to be as good as they were a year ago. They're going to be capable, but they're probably, an 8 or 9 win Mountain West team, and Oregon should be able to take care of business there. I keep looking at the schedule and thinking that, look, 9-3 might be a worst case scenario for this schedule. I think there's a 90+% chance that Oregon is winning at least 10 games this year with how everything shakes out, because Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, Washington, yeah, they all have my attention at some level. I think Oregon's winning at least 3 of those.
Yeah, I liked your point about Ohio State coming to Eugene and Oregon having to go out to Ann Arbor and how that is maybe the more favorable, especially with a coaching change in Ann Arbor. I'm still kind of interested. I'm not really sure how I feel about Michigan just yet because of how much they lost and just because they have a new coach. And a new quarterback. Like, that's another big part of it. So I do like your point there. And then I think a couple other games to keep an eye on. Obviously, you have the game against Wisconsin out in Madison. I don't know if I'm saying this just because I'm hearing one of my best buddies in the back of my head. I'm kind of keeping an eye out for that Purdue game just because you have to go out to West Lafayette. Freaking cold. That's the week after Ohio State. Win or lose, that's going to be an emotionally taxing game. But that said, I think that Dan Lanning has definitely proven to be a little bit better than his predecessor at making sure his team gets up for every game and doesn't play down to their opponent. I'm looking at you, Cal 2021. Yeah, I think 10 wins is
that reference.
Is definitely realistic. And I feel like the floor kind of feels like 9 wins.
Yeah. First of all, the Cal 2021 reference is so on par, because I agree that the Cristobal administration had a lot of good things about it. You can't look at, his time in Eugene and say that it was just a complete and utter mess. It was not. The most, I think, frustrating element was playing up and down to the level of their competition. I think Lanning has done an excellent job in just 2 years as a head coach of making sure his team plays to their standard every week. You think about, I think the biggest early win he had was 2022 against BYU. You had the Georgia debacle and then Eastern Washington. You didn't really know what to make of it. And then BYU came in ranked 25th and Oregon kind of housed them at Autzen. Or you think about, the UCLA game that year, which was College Game Day, and the Bruins were unbeaten at the time and Oregon won the game by 15 points. And I think of like Cal this past season. That Cal team last year was significantly better than the Cal team in 2021. Played at the same stadium. Oregon won last year. What was it, 62-21? So like something in that sort of range, 63. Like it was some big, blowout once they got past the fumble. And in 2021,
63-19.
Yeah, 63-19. You had in 2021 a 1-5 Cal team that admittedly played better football down the stretch. They were 1-5 that came to Autzen, and Oregon needed a fourth down goal line stand to win the game at home. And I think whatever discussion you want to have about Dan Lanning as a head coach, I think Josh Pate has made a couple really good points in the last week talking about him on his show about the narrative about Dan Lanning is, he doesn't win enough big games. He doesn't have a conference. He doesn't do that. And he's like, he's been a head coach for 2 seasons. Two seasons. Like he had a hilarious line. I was telling my dad about it earlier that where he said, well, people say Dan Lanning always does this. Dan Lanning doesn't always park in the same spot. Like he just doesn't, he hasn't established himself. And you look at the other coaches that have won national championships, that have won multiple national championships, it can take over 5 years to get to that sort of level. You played a high level in the years preceding it, but Kirby didn't win. He got to a national championship 2018. He took over 2015 or 16. And you look at Jim Harbaugh, for instance, didn't play for a national championship until this past year. He took over 2015 or 2016. Like they took over around the same time. Like you're on the other side of the halfway point to a decade before these guys had their programs playing at that sort of level. And, I think Lanning has set the expectations really high. He certainly does with the way that he recruits, the way Oregon brings in transfer portal players, their roster retention. Like there's a lot of hype around the season. But I just look at the schedule and, I feel like they're going to be favored in every game except Ohio State, where they're just a mild underdog. They probably won't be a big favorite going to the Big House to play Michigan, but I think the schedule works out really well. And I think 10 wins is kind of the baseline standard for success.
I definitely agree with you on the 10 wins being well within reach for Oregon. The last point I wanted to just add on the 2021 Cal thing, when you look back at that season, Spencer, it might make negative sense. It makes negative sense.
It does.
That Oregon was able to go into Columbus with Anthony Brown as the quarterback, beat the Buckeyes at home, and then they come back to Eugene and narrowly escape Cal.
They lost to a 3-9 Stanford team in the same year they beat Ohio State on the road. That's college football at its finest. But what is that?
That was a crazy game. That Stanford game was a battle. And I remember, I'm always going to remember this, Spencer. That was one of my favorite seasons to cover because I was like kind of traveling with the team. I wasn't on the plane, but I was, following them and whatnot. But I was in Palo Alto for that game because I'm from the Bay Area. So I got to go home, see my mom and everything. And that press box is like, you're like shoulder to shoulder to everybody. So when they were like, oh yeah, whoever wants to go down on the field, go for it. Like nobody else, I'm telling you, Spencer, no one else wanted to go. And I'm like, oh man, get me down there. And I'm like, just in case some craziness happens. And then what do you know? That game ended the way that it did. But just to kind of put a bow on this, talking about the Lanning stuff with Pate, he hasn't been there very long. So it's like, if you're looking at what he's been able to accomplish, the only team he's really lost to is Washington, if you can look at it, from year to year. And that's obviously huge because that's one of Oregon's biggest rivals. But look at what Washington has done. They went to the national championship. They lost their coach, but where did he go? He took over for Nick Saban at Alabama, one of the most prestigious programs of all time. And mean, if that's the only guy you're losing to, it's tough because
I just thought of it.
The margin for error is slim.
Yeah, I agree. And sorry to cut you off, but I just thought of a baseball analogy that you'll be able to appreciate. You're a San Francisco Giants fan. If you're pitching against the Dodgers and you go 7 innings and you give up 3 runs, but the only runs you gave up, the only hits you gave up were Shohei Ohtani homers, do you look at that guy and go, oh man, he's just an okay pitcher. Like he had just an average day. Or did he pitch really well and then Shohei Ohtani got you? Like Kalen DeBoer was just really good. And DeBoer is just much more experienced and Lanning is not. And I think he's going to continue to get better as a head coach because I've seen that so far in the 2 seasons he's been with Oregon. I have no reason to expect it's not going to continue to improve.
Yeah, I think the last thing I was gonna say is like the margin for error is so small, so it's like you lose to Washington, and it's like, well, I don't know if any fans saying it's a failure of a season necessarily. I mean, that's really doomsday thinking. But the reality of it is, you could say that he had a Washington problem, but now Kalen DeBoer isn't there, so you would think Jed Fish is a good coach, man, but you would think it's gonna get easier, especially with the way that roster was depleted, to kind of get over that Washington hump moving forward in 2024 and beyond. But also, when you look at those losses, it doesn't matter what team it's to. You didn't get it done when you needed to, and I'm sure that Dan Lanning would tell anybody that, where he asked in a press conference, you got to win those big games. So I think that that's the game that everyone wants to hone in on, because they lost two of them last year, and they haven't beaten Washington since he's been the head coach. But I think that they're doing all the right things to change that, and you got to give Washington their credit where it's due. And a lot of Duck fans don't like doing that, but you got to do that, and line it up again in 24.
Yeah, I also, going back to a point made earlier, that Purdue game, second year for Ryan Walters as the head coach, respectable quarterback, like crazy stuff just happens against Purdue. But what you pointed out, which is whether you win or lose against Ohio State, it's going to be emotionally charged in one way or the other, and it'll feel different. It'll feel incredibly different, and it's on the road. It's going to be a Friday night game as well. So yeah, I mean, crazier things have happened before, but I still look at Oregon's schedule and I feel really good. So does Max Torres. We appreciate you coming by. As always, my man, good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on, Spencer. Appreciate it.
Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.